It's that time again, Our Town Live, where friends, family, people you know, and others you'd rather not know share with us their unique bits of wisdom. And now, here's Herb, your host, for another show.
Today, we speak with Shelley Neese, Vice President of the Jerusalem Connection. After nearly a decade of writing the Copper Scroll Project, the remarkable story of one man's quest to decipher the ancient map leading to the gold and silver temple vessels, the book is finally being published. Not only does Neese chronicle this amazing story, but she was an integral player in much of it. A native of Louisiana, she first came to Israel in 2000 with her husband, a U.S. Air Force physician. With no knowledge of Israel, she became intensely curious about the country and received her M.A. in Middle Eastern Studies from Ben Gurion University. She spent the months leading up to the Gaza disengagement in 2005 in Israel, working with a team of negotiators. When she went back to the U.S., she became the assistant to the Consul General at the Consulate of Israel to New England. Without further delay, here's Shelley. Tell me about the promise of the Copper Scroll Project. What is that, and who are you?
I have been following the story of the Copper Scroll Project for 10 years. Most of that time, I didn't tell anyone that I was studying the Copper Scroll and following this story, and had a dream of writing a book about it, because I feel like everyone has a dream about writing a book. And it's like a pregnancy. In the first trimester, you keep it quiet until you know whether or not it's viable. And also I telecommute, so I also didn't really want my boss wondering how much time I was putting towards a project that may or may not pan out. But the Copper Scroll is an adventure tale. It follows the actual scroll, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and talks about all of the people who've gone in pursuit of its promise, but focuses in on one guy named Jim Barfield.
Before you tell me about Jim, tell me just a little bit, because some people, believe it or not, don't have a clue what the Dead Sea Scrolls are.
But that kind of excites me, because in the book, one of my friends, a mom, said, even a mom can read this book. And I thought, well, it was written by a mom. But my dream is really, I want to use the book as a teaching tool for things like that. I feel like if you don't know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, then you absolutely should. Part of the process is telling the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which the Copper Scroll is one of. But the Dead Sea Scrolls are our oldest surviving biblical manuscripts by 1,000 years. Found the first ones in 1948, and really just kind of turned biblical scholarship on its head in terms of how we date the biblical canon, what Isaiah looks like, what Jeremiah looks like 2,000 years ago, and being able to compare that and study that to the text that we have today just seems like a real gift, especially for believers, for Jews and Christians, for people that this text is the most important thing in their faith journey. Being able to access a 2,000-year-old version of that, it just seems like a dream.
When I mentioned this to my wife last night, who has been, by the way, as an adult was bat mitzvahed, she said to me, when I said to her, it's a scroll written on copper, she said, you're out of your mind. What are you talking about? And she's well read. What would you say to her?
Right. Wait, so you mean she did a bat mitzvah as an adult, not at 13?
No, way over 50.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that. You don't hear that much. So the Copper Scroll, no one's heard of it. First of all, I would tell her, don't feel bad or don't feel less read. Since the very beginning, when the Copper Scroll was found, it was immediately downplayed. I think part of that is because there were so many scrolls flooding the market at that time, and so there was no lack of news. I think now if the Copper Scroll surfaced, it would be on every headline, but at least for that time period, it was diluted with just a general flood in the antiquities market of other scrolls, and scrolls that told us a lot more about either the Bible or the way the Jewish people lived in that time period, and the Essenes, the probable authors of the scrolls, more things about them. And the Copper Scroll is pretty boring by itself. If you're not intrigued by why a scroll made out of copper would exist than just reading it by itself. I mean, it reads just kind of like an inventory of precious metals. So that part's always going to be interesting. But still, there's no verb, there's no literary value to the copper scroll.
Why does a copper scroll exist?
So there's obviously a lot of debate about this, and all debates within the Dead Sea Scrolls genre can end in in fistfights. But the copper scroll is clearly marking some sort of rescue operation for a load of treasure. Whether or not there's debate about how much a talent is worth 2,000 years ago, and whether or not the copper scroll is using the standard version of talent. But at the very least, it's pointing to 60 tons of gold, silver, bronze, or vessels. Most scholars agree that the treasure had to have been authentic because, and when I say most scholars agree, I mean there was actually a vote on this at a copper scroll conference at Manchester University, and it was almost unanimous among all of the scholars present that the copper scroll had to be real and had to be authentic and had to be pointing to real treasure, just because otherwise its existence makes no sense. It clearly isn't part of any legend or, folklore, because it just doesn't have those kind of qualities. It would have been expensive to make it, difficult to etch it out, and the fact that it was hidden away and tucked in a cave, sort of furthers that narrative. But basically, I think, if we're just going to, what I've based the last 10 years of research on is that it points to a covert temple rescue operation, probably the Second Temple period, just based off of the language of the copper scroll, and probably with some idea that the Romans were knocking at the gate and the treasury of the temple was full, and there was some way that priests were able to secret out some of that treasury, just like maybe some priests were able to secret out the scrolls that we now have as a huge Dead Sea Scroll library. So I feel like because the Dead Sea Scroll library exists, it doesn't make that idea so far-reaching.
Have you met, or do you know of any people that are formally, even today, looking for the treasure?
There are. John Allegro was the very first one to champion the copper scroll. He is who we can credit for the copper scroll even being opened in the first place. The copper scroll was really, really fragile to the touch when it was first found, and took 3 years to figure out how to open it. And John Allegro was a member of the Dead Sea Scroll editor team who really made sure that happened and made the copper scroll his mission. He is not an archaeologist, but he did pursue looking for copper scroll treasure. He didn't really have the patience or temperament to kind of follow it all the way through, or really the approval of his colleagues. Next on that list, someone who read his book and was an American airline pilot named Bob Morgan went to one of the sites that John Allegro identified with copper scroll treasure. It's called Hircania, and it's kind of like a lesser Masada. It's in the Judean desert, but it's a Herodian fortress. And it had been unexcavated and with kind of weird tunnels attached to the bottom of the mountain, dug into the mountain. So really a lot of people got it in their head that those tunnels would lead to copper scroll treasure. Bob Morgan was definitely an eccentric non-archaeologist doing just that, but he eventually got the help of Oren Gutfeld, who is a Hebrew University Israeli archaeologist and has had his own celebrated career even outside of copper scroll. But those tunnels eventually dead-ended. Oren Gutfeld is a friend at this point. And he's told me that he couldn't speak for a few days after, digging just tons and tons of dirt and clearing out these few tunnels. And then at the end, not only, just the fact that they dead-ended and didn't end in really any treasure or ancient remains, but also just no explanation for even why they existed. Jim Barfield is the last, and he's the subject of my book, and he's really the only one who Oh, I forgot to say Vendell Jones. Vendell Jones is kind of the one who most famously looked for Copper Scroll treasure for about 30 years. Also a rogue explorer, and he influenced Jim Barfield. Even, they never worked together, but just his pursuit and passion for the Copper Scroll definitely influenced Jim Barfield, who is the only one who kind of remains. But I mean, out of all those that I just listed, only one was an actual archaeologist.
You mentioned Jim Barfield, and he's part of your book, I believe. What influence has he had on your life?
Sure. So I met him 10 years ago and wrote an article for Jerusalem Post just as a young journalist kind of looking for a story. And the fact that he's a retired arson investigator from Oklahoma. And when I met him, he had just, in 2008, he had just had a meeting with the Israel Antiquities Authority. And how he got that meeting was through just kind of a crazy sort of human turn of events that involved a Comanche artist who taught at a community college that Jim Barfield also taught at, but happened at one point in her young adulthood to have been the host mom for a young soldier who ended up being the head of the Israel Antiquities Authority many, many years later. So just kind of one of those crazy stories that seemed to me worthy of telling in its own right, of how these two people got connected. And at first I played the role of investigative journalist and tried to just follow his pursuit from kind of a dry journalist perspective. But eventually I just became really attached to him and to his family, and to, he's kind of built this team and cadre of allies around him. And so really just beneficial to my own life in terms of adventure and education, I guess. And so in the book, I mean, I definitely don't hide my bias probably towards whether or not he's true, whether or not he's right. I definitely advocate for him being someone that you would kind of want to place a bet on.
Great. Let me ask you, what inspires your ideas?
Well, that's a good question. Well, this sounds terrible. Even when my kids, when they say kind of, like bring your parent to school day and what does your parent do? One of my younger kids said, well, my mom's looking for the Ark of the Covenant. So I definitely don't want to be tagged, as an Ark seeker. But ever since I can remember, I mean, I've just always had a fascination with not treasure hunting, because that doesn't really seem relevant to me, but just biblical archaeology. And over the last 40 years, just unfolding the biblical narrative, seeing the historicity of the Bible, seeing kind of like what point in the Bible we can pin down, and starting pretty much from Hezekiah on, it gets pretty easy to do that, and finding some sort of historical or textual evidence of stories in the Bible outside of the Bible. And I really just can't get enough of that. And the Copper Scroll, in its own way, even though it uses less biblical language than any other Dead Sea Scroll, even though it doesn't have any, real biblical characters or insight, in its own way, I feel like it kind of encompasses the whole thing, including the hope that's attached to one day being able to sort of unearth something. I'm not saying the Ark of the Covenant, but something attached to the first or second temple, or, just something, to be able to hold up something. Nothing has ever been found from the interior of either temple. And there's a lot that can explain that away, that Jerusalem has been destroyed and built back up dozens of times, and no one's allowed to dig there currently. I'm not saying, not stoking a conspiracy of why nothing from the interiors have ever been found, but I just really want to be a part of something being found.
Great. Is there a place in the world you've been meaning to visit? If so, where, that you haven't been to yet?
Good question. Amman, Jordan is where the Copper Scroll actually is. And so it is separated from the rest of the Dead Sea Scroll corpus, which is in Jerusalem. And so I've visited the Dead Sea Scrolls many times, but here I am, and I've written this book, and, you know, the Copper Scroll has